Hi guys, welcome back to AP Environmental Science. In today's video, we're going to be covering the island biogeography theory, which you guys should have learned a little bit about when you did your island biogeography bean lab. Okay, so species are not uniformly distributed over the Earth's surface. Diversity varies greatly from place to place. As a reminder, all species are adapted to live in their specific habitats, and habitats are shaped by biomes, and biomes are shaped by Earth's climate. So around the world, there are a different variety of species depending on what biome they're a part of. So recognition of these worldwide patterns in animal species was the first step in understanding biogeography, which is the geographic distribution of species. After an island is formed, either through convergent plate boundaries or, lava hotspots in the ocean, it will soon be inhabited by organisms. The size and distance from the mainland affect the number of species that the island can support. Immigration rates and extinction rates also play a role in the number of species that are a part of the island. So as extinction increases, immigration decreases, and the point of intersection is the equilibrium for the island. Islands that are closer to the mainland or other large islands will have higher rates of immigration. However, as more species inhabit the island, immigration will decrease because there's no more room. With more species come higher extinction rates. So the study of how species are distributed and interact on islands is the theory of the island biogeography theory. And typically larger islands will have more species due to the resources available. In your bean lab, you guys should have seen that the larger islands overall had higher average populations because they're bigger. More beans could fit on the island. Bigger islands means more resources available, less chances of competition. Islands that are closer to the mainland also have more species diversity. It's easier for animals to get to those islands if they're closer to the mainland. So as we look here at these two different graphs, the island area that are larger, they have higher number of species, and so on and so forth. So this works for many species living on islands. So there's a few different factors that influence this. Again, the distance effect. The farther an island lies from a continent, the fewer species tend to find it and colonize it. Thus, remote islands host few species because of low immigration. I asked you guys in your lab, what would be reasons why not all 100 beans, which represented birds, made it to the island? What would be a few natural reasons why? And a lot of you guys put weather, you guys put starvation or exhaustion. If an island is really far away from the mainland, birds cannot fly hundreds of miles without food or resting, and weather could definitely play a big role. So the further an island is away from the mainland, there's tend to be lower instances of populations and species finding it to colonize it. Also the size as well, as we've been talking about, bigger islands can hold more species. Also, if they're bigger, they can be seen from further away, so organisms can fly to it. Larger islands have lower extinction rates because more species allow for larger populations, which are less likely to drop to zero by chance from natural disturbances, which we'll talk about in our next topic. So studies show that larger, closer islands have higher species and numbers and tend to be more biodiverse. And that's really all this topic is. Now let's talk about ecological tolerance. So this goes back to what we were talking about with our discussion on generalist and specialist species about how all living things have a range of tolerance that they can withstand. And, it's about finding what is just right. It's kind of like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, finding what is just right for you. And all species on Earth have their range of what is just right. We all can't be adapted to everything, and humans are the exception to this rule. We're one of the few species that has been able to colonize and live in all different types of climates and conditions, but that's primarily due to our intelligence and the technology we've been able to develop to live in all sorts of climates. whereas other species that lack that intelligence are only able to live in the areas that they're adapted to. So what are these factors in ecosystems that organisms have to be adapted to? So as a reminder, habitats are shaped by biomes, and biomes are shaped by climate, which is the average temperature and precipitation, which is influenced by latitude, longitude, the tilt of the earth, solar insolation, etc. So this is all stuff from previous units. So we should know a little bit about temperature, pressure, salinity, and pH. All of those things influence how an organism lives because they are adapted to certain temperatures. Polar bears, you'll not see them, in deserts because they have those thick fur coats. They're adapted to live in colder climates. Salinity is the salt concentrations. So saltwater fish cannot live in fresh water. They're not adapted to live in those climates. Pressure is the pressure within an organism's ecosystem. So organisms that live further down in the deeper depths of the ocean can withstand high pressure. And if they're brought up to the surface, their body changes. And that's the blobfish right over here. This is what a blobfish would look like at standard surface pressures, but deep down in the ocean where they live, they actually look relatively normal. Flow rate is the different speeds of water flow in aquatic ecosystems. So any suctioning organism like starfish that need to suction onto a surface, if the water is flowing too fast that their suctions can't keep up, they're not able to live in that ecosystem. They need the right type of flow rate. And pH is the acidity or alkalinity of the environment. This is really particular with bacteria because some bacteria thrive at different pH. You'll actually find different types of bacteria in different parts of your gut microbiome because the difference in pH in your gut versus your stomach and your lower and upper intestines is different. So different bacteria will live at different pHs. And smaller organisms tend to be more susceptible to changes in these abiotic factors because their homeostasis isn't as in depth as a bigger, larger organism. And sunlight, too, is a big factor as well. So ecological tolerance is the range at which organisms perform particularly well in their habitat. This is also known as the fundamental niche, or where the species can survive, grow, and reproduce successfully. And it's dependent on those abiotic factors. So the optimum range is the preferred niche, the preferred abiotic factors that they can live in. The tolerance range is where you can go a little bit outside of that range, but still survive and reproduce, just maybe not as well. And then the zone of intolerance is the unavailable niche. Organisms cannot live there if they're not adapted to those climates or those abiotic factors. They just will not survive and reproduce. However, we know because there's competition in the wild, either intraspecific within species or interspecific between species, that living things are going to compete for ecological resources such as food, water, and shelter. So even though they do have this fundamental niche, this range of where they can survive and reproduce, because of competition, they're going to be limited because they're competing over different ecological resources. So this is the realized niche. It's what they actually can do and where they actually can live because of competition. Remember, organisms carry out resource partitioning in order to avoid the competitive exclusion principle, to not carry out the competitive exclusion principle. So living things will divide up a habitat or share different food or eat at different times of the day, not necessarily because they're adapted to that, but because they need to do those things in order to not go extinct. Because the competitive exclusion principle says there will always be a variation in traits. One species will always be better at the other in obtaining resources they need to survive. So they do niche partitioning, which is dividing up a habitat and its resources in order to not go extinct. So the realized niche is what an organism is actually doing and eating and living in its environment because of competition. So human activities such as burning fossil fuels and deforestation have resulted in global climate change, sea ice melting, etc. And global climate change is the shifting in climate, the average temperature and precipitation around the world. So because of this, biomes, which are shaped by climate, are changing and shifting to different locations as the planet's climate change. So this has resulted in a shift in the abiotic factors that organisms rely on for their survival. And not just the abiotic factors, but the biotic ones as well. Plants, the base of our food chain, our primary producers, they grow primarily dependent on abiotic factors, on temperature, pH, nutrients, sunlight, water, etc. They're adapted to those abiotic factors. But herbivores, carnivores, they need to be adapted to abiotic and biotic factors. So habitats are shifting and changing over time, which are forcing species to change and adapt to these different environments. And I want to make something very clear. When we say that species have been forced to adapt, adaptations are not a conscious decision that animals do or that plants do. You either have the beneficial trait or you don't. And the beneficial trait can change depending on what the environmental selective pressure is. And where do they get these traits from? From their DNA. We can't change our DNA. We can't change our genotypes. Humans can change their physical traits, but at the end of the day, we're not changing our DNA when we're dyeing our hair. Okay, so I want to make that very clear that species do not choose to evolve. They don't even choose to adapt. Their populations are forced to adapt, and their genotypes change over time depending on what is favorable or not favorable in the current conditions of the environment. So, for example, when it's really cold in the Arctic, polar bears that have those thick coats, they would be better adapted than than polar bears that have thinner coats because it's cold. They need to stay warm. But as it's getting warmer towards the Arctic and the sea ice is melting, thicker coated polar bears may not be as well adapted as the polar bears that have thinner coats. They might be able to survive and reproduce better. Their ecological tolerance is shifting towards what they're adapted to or what they're better adapted for. So, knowing a species' ecological tolerance combined with the fact that environmental changes cause a species to move can help identify which species are vulnerable to extinctions. There have been 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's geological history. It's estimated that 99% of the species that have lived on the planet are now extinct. And of these 5 mass extinctions, the majority of life died out due to catastrophic events, meteors, global climate change, ice ages, so on and so forth. So in our next topic, which will be our next video, we'll talk about these natural disruptions to ecosystems and how they change or disturb communities and biodiversity.